Game studios use graphics like this all the time, and most people assume that they are impossible to recreate. This card looks like something pulled straight out of a game UI, but it was built entirely in DaVinci Resolve. And what I really wanted to explore here is how far you can push depth and motion without turning it into a heavy 3D pipeline. Before we go further, I want to quickly mention something up front. The version you just saw is a premium card I designed separately, with more depth, more detail, and a fully customizable structure. If you want that exact version, you can find it linked in the description down below. In this video though, I'll walk you through the workflow and design logic behind building a card like this from scratch. This isn't a heavy 3D workflow, it's about layering, spacing, and motion inside DaVinci Resolve. Make sure to leave a comment down below on what you guys want to learn next. So we are here in a new DaVinci Resolve project, and let me first show you my project settings. My timeline resolution is 1920 by 1080, which is basically 1080p, and my frame rate is 30 FPS. Feel free to copy my settings. Now I'm gonna go to Effects, make sure Toolbox is selected. I'm gonna go to the search bar and search for Fusion Composition. Drag an empty Fusion composition into your timeline, and right click on it and open in Fusion page. As you can see, we are in Fusion now, and let's start by building the frame of the card, so the base. To do that, we're gonna first add a background node. If you hit Ctrl plus space on your keyboard and search for background and press add, you will add a background node. And to preview this background node, we can drag it to our viewer here. As you can see, we have a blank black background now, but I want this background to be a gradient instead of a solid color. If we go to our inspector here and switch type from solid color to gradient, as you can see, we have a gradient now. To change the color of our gradient, as you can see, there are two arrows under gradient here, and each arrow corresponds for a color. Now the gradient I'm going for is a dark bluish gradient, so I'm gonna click this arrow and go to color and paste this exact hex value. As you can see, this changed. We're gonna go to our second arrow, and let me just drag my other color here. Then open this up, go to hex, and paste this exact color. We now have this really nice dark bluish gradient here. Now we're gonna click our background node and press this rectangle mask over here. As you can see, we added a rectangle mask, which is basically masking out certain parts of the clip. We can control that however we want here. If you go to height here, you can adjust the height, you can adjust the width. Now we're going for a card design here, so I'm just gonna mess with the height and width until I get something that I like. And now let's have the corners rounded here instead of sharp corners. We're gonna go to corner radius and increase that a bit. As you can see, the corners are getting rounded now, but I don't want it super round, so I'm just gonna go for like a slight round over here. There we go. Now let's add a different colored outline to this card. I'm gonna get this SM outline node. I will leave the link in the description down below where you can download it for free. And let's connect our background node to the outline node and preview it. As you can see, we added an outline to our card here. Now to change the color of this outline, let's go to our inspector here, and instead of solid color, we can do gradient. As you can see, we have a smooth gradient now, but let's change the color of that to a goldish color. Let's click our arrow here and go to color, and then let me paste this goldish color here. And for my other color, I have a different shade of gold here, so I'm just gonna paste that. We now have this clean outline, but it's a bit too thick for me, so we're gonna go to SM outline again. And for stroke, I'm gonna decrease that until I'm happy with the results. And there we go, we now have our card frame. Let me add a slight glow to it, so I'm gonna search for soft glow and add that. Connect my SM outline to the glow and preview it here. As you can see, the glow is a bit too much here for me. I'm just gonna tune in the settings until I'm happy with the results. There we go, we now have the complete card frame. Let's work on the image that will go here now. But before that, let's do some node management here. If we highlight all nodes and press Ctrl plus space and search for an underlay, if we add that, as you can see, we added this like group or a box around our nodes, which will basically help us highlight what those nodes are for. Now, while holding down Alt, I click the underlay and go right click, rename, and then we can do card frame here. So we now know these nodes are for the card frame. Let's add the image now. Drag in your own image. As you can see, I have this image, this AI generated image. It looks really cool with those cards, so I'm gonna leave that. Now let's select our added media in node here and click this button for transform. This will come in handy later, I will leave it for now. After that, let's go and add a background node. For this background node, I want it transparent, so I'm gonna go to the inspector and drag the alpha all the way to 0 here. Let's preview it. As you can see, we got a blank canvas here, basically transparent. We're gonna connect this transform node to our background node. As you can see, it automatically added a merge node between them. We're gonna select this background, hit Ctrl and C, and then Ctrl V to basically duplicate this. And go to the output of this merge node and connect it to the output of the background node to add another merge. This will all make sense in a bit, just bear with me. If we drag our merge node, as you can see, we have this image. Now, if I go to the transform, I can scale down the image a bit. If I hit the merge node and go to rectangle mask, as you can see, we now have a mask. And now if you connect the output of this merge node to the output of this soft glow, we have this other merge over here, basically merging our frame with our image. Let's preview that merge. As you can see, it's still not fit here. Let's make that fit by the mask we added here. We can mess with the height and the width to make it fit perfectly. We can also move our mask here to basically align it. And as you can see, we now have a place where our image sits in. Now to make our image fit well inside this frame, remember this transform node? Select that. We can move this transform node, and as you can see, if we mess with the size also, we can make it smaller or bigger. Now I am happy with that, but if you notice, we don't have rounded edges here. So we go to our rectangle node and drag the corner radius up a bit. And as you can see, we added this rounded corner here. You may be wondering why we added this other merge node. Well, we're gonna add a bit of feather at the bottom here. So we're gonna add another rectangle mask to this. Make the height shorter a bit. Width can be full width. As you can see, once we move this other rectangle node we added, we are like cutting certain sections off the image. Now to add the feather now, we can turn up soft edge a bit. And as you can see, it's making the cutoff smoother here. I'm happy with that. Now to make it not affect the upper section here, we can increase the height a bit more, then drag it up. Perfect, we now added a feather here and our image is done. You can rescale it using this transform node and move it as you wish. Now let's select all these nodes and hit Ctrl plus space and search for an underlay. So we now know this group is basically the image part. And if you hold down Alt on your keyboard and click this underlay, right click, rename, we can do card image. Now let's add the text. If we search for text plus here, there we go, and press add. And if we drag it to preview it and type something like game, card, and now let's customize the text to make it look better. Now for font, I'm gonna go for Montserrat, and then for font weight, I'm gonna do black. There we go. Now if we go to our shading tab here and switch type from solid to gradient, we can do the exact same gradient we did in the outline here. So we can go to this one, press on the color, highlight all of this, Ctrl C to copy it, go back to our text, and paste the color basically. There you go. But I've noticed too much space here between the two words, so I'm gonna go back to the text tab here and then turn down line spacing a bit. Now to see our text with the card, we can connect the output of this text node to the output of this merge node, and let's preview that. Now we can add a transform after this text and then move it down a bit so we can fit it better. And let's go back to the text and make it a bit smaller because it's a bit too big now. Now let's add a slight glow also around the text. If we go to this transform node and shift space and do soft glow, as you can see, we added some glow here, but it's a bit too much. As you guys notice, we're gonna decrease the gain. Now I'm gonna go back and make the text a bit smaller, and for font weight I think I'm gonna do extra bold instead of black because it's a bit too thick. And now we're basically done with the text. Let's select all these nodes, go to underlay again, Alt, right click, rename to main text. Finally, let's add the description of the card. So we're gonna go add another text plus node here again. Now if we drag our text plus node to our viewer and type some description, I already have this one already prepared. For font, I'm gonna do Montserrat again, and for font weight, I'm gonna do regular. Now let's connect this text node to the output of this merge node to see everything, and if we drag this merge node here, we can see everything that we got so far. Now let's make this fit well. So if we drag it down a bit and make the size smaller, and if we go to a certain part of our text, let's say after the width, and then press enter, as you can see we now have two lines. If you make those a bit smaller in size, as you can see it fits really well now. Now I want the description to be slightly grayish, so I'm gonna just change the color here into a more grayish color, as you can see here. There we go, and this looks perfect now. Again, let's add an underlay and name this description. And the cool thing about underlays, guys, if we go to these three dots, as you can see, we have all our underlays here. And if we click on one, it will take us to this exact one, which is really convenient. Now let's make this card 3D, shall we? If we go to all our merge nodes here that connect everything together and delete them, you're gonna see why in just a sec. And then we're gonna add something called merge 3D. This is where the 3D part comes alive. After that merge 3D, we're gonna add a transform 3D. This will all make sense in just a bit. And after that transform 3D, we're gonna add another merge 3D. And after this merge, we're gonna add a renderer 3D. I know this is a lot, but everything will make sense in just a bit. And finally, this render 3D goes into our media out. To make those 3D elements, so we're basically separating them into layers, every part of it. The image, the frame, the text, and the description. To make everything a plane, we're gonna go to this output of the soft glow here, and then go to image plane 3D and add that. And connect the soft glow to our green input of our image plane 3D. We're gonna do the same thing with this merge 3D. We're gonna go to image plane 3D. There we go. Now we accidentally did that, so let's just delete. And then connect the merge node with the green input. And then let's do the exact same for all of those. And as you can see now, we have every layer of our card connected to an image plane. And all those image planes will go into our first merge 3D. It doesn't matter if it's the white input or the yellow input on this merge 3D. So we're gonna connect everything here. Now let's enable double viewer here. As you can see, we have two previews now. And if we drag our merge node here, as you can see, we are in 3D space now. To navigate this, if you hold down Alt and middle mouse button, we can rotate around this plane over here. And to navigate left and right, you can just use the mouse wheel without holding Alt, as you can see here. Now let's go to front view here. And if you go to image plane 3D here, there's a transform section in the inspector. And if we mess with the Z, as you can see, we're moving this backwards and forwards. Now let's reset that because the card frame will be at the exact same place. We're gonna go to our image now and move it a bit in front by going to the transform and Z. And you can always rotate and see how much you are going. We can either make it a bit too far away for a more parallax look, but I want a subtle parallax look. Basically, I'm just gonna offset it by a bit here. And now if we go to the image plane associated with our text here and move it, as you can see, we have the text now in front of our image. And let's go for the image plane for the description and move it in front, as you can see here. And if you notice, everything is a separate layer now. Now to actually see this 3D scene, we need something called the 3D camera. So if we go here and add a camera, you find camera 3D here. If we add it and connect the output of it to this input of the merge 3D node, as you can see, we have a camera now in our scene, as you can see here. Now we're gonna add a transform 3D after this camera to basically move it. And if we go to our media out now and drag it here, you don't see anything, and that's because the camera is too close. If we go to the transform we added after the camera and move it a bit far back using the Z, we now see our 3D scene rendered on screen. Now for better preview, go to the renderer 3D node, and for renderer type, go to hardware renderer. This will basically make it easier for your PC to handle. Now remember this transform 3D we added after this merge 3D node that contains all our image planes? Well, if we go to that and go to rotation, and let's try rotating it around the Y, we now have this parallax effect. Let me just make it full screen to show you. If we rotate this, we now have this crazy parallax look. Now let's do some animation. If we go to the transform 3D and add another transform 3D after it, if we go to our transform that we added and go to like frame 20 and keyframe the translation here by basically pressing all of this, you can see it's keyframed by those turning orange. And if we go back to our 0 frame and move the transform back like this and up like so, maybe move it further a bit back, and if you notice, we have now the animation. Now the other animation I want to add is basically the card tilt, so we're gonna add another transform 3D node after this. We're gonna go to when the animation ends, right on frame 20, and then while this last transform 3D is selected, we can keyframe the rotation like so. And if we go like maybe 30 frames, maybe to frame 50, and then we mess with this a bit, just a tiny bit, there we go. And if you notice, we now have the tilt transition. Now let's reset the tilt, so I'm gonna go 30 frames after 50 to 80, and then reset this to 0. As you can see now, the card tilts and then resets. Now to smooth out the keyframes a bit, we're gonna go to our spline editor here. Let's select everything and press on this icon so everything fits here. And then if we go Ctrl A to select every keyframe and press S on our keyboard, if you notice, we smoothed out the animation here. We now have this smooth animation. You can basically do lots of stuff with animation, but I will leave the creativity to you. Now lastly, let me show you how you can easily change the colors of the text and the frame here. Let me first disable my spline viewer here and go to empty space. and then add a color corrector node. And then we can copy this color corrector node and go to our card frame. And after this SM outline node, we're gonna right click and paste instance. What this basically does is it copies this exact same color corrector to this one. So if we change any setting with this color corrector, the changes will apply to this one too. Now if I break the output here and then connect this node to our yellow input of our color corrector node, and output goes into the soft glow. Now we're gonna go to our text here and make it a bit bigger. We're gonna do the exact same thing, paste instance, and then you can easily connect it between two nodes by holding down shift and dragging it. There we go. It's connected now. Now if you notice, if I go to color corrector here and shift the hue, the card is changing color. If you notice, it's also changing the background color. We don't want that. So let me reset that back. To fix this, it's gonna be a bit messy here. So let me just make it bigger a bit. Now the background node output will go into the blue input of the color corrector, which is basically the mask input. Now let's go back to our color controller here and mess with the hue. If you notice, now it's actually changing the background but leaving the edges untouched. To easily fix that, go back to the instance of the color corrector, go to settings. As you can see here, there's something called apply mask inverted. We're gonna right click that and do de-instance, and then check that box. And finally, if we go back to our color corrector, we now have customizable color. Beautiful. And that's the core workflow behind building achievement style cards like this in DaVinci Resolve. And if there's a specific animation or design that you want me to break down next, leave it in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.